My son was rotting away in his own living room, and the doctors called it a rare autoimmune disease, while my daughter-in-law called it a tragedy. But my 10-year-old grandson, Leo, called it what it really was: murder. During a silent dinner that tasted like ash and fear, he slipped a crumpled piece of paper into my palm under the table. It was a map to a secret that would shatter my reality. If you have ever felt in your gut that someone you loved was in danger but couldn't prove it, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what I found in Storage Unit 385 wasn't just old furniture. It was a countdown clock. My name is Desmond Bell. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years as a structural engineer building bridges that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in concrete before the whole thing comes down. But I never saw the cracks in my own family until it was too late. That Tuesday evening, I drove my old Ford truck to my son Terrence's house. It was a beautiful colonial-style home that Terrence had renovated with his own hands back when those hands were strong enough to crush a brick. Now the house loomed in the twilight like a mausoleum. I walked up the driveway, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the warmth of a family dinner. It was the smell. Even before I reached the front porch, the chemical stench assaulted my nose. It was a mix of industrial-strength bleach rubbing alcohol and something sweet and rotting underneath like flowers left too long on a grave. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like a hospital ward where people go to die. I rang the bell and waited. It took too long. When the door finally opened, it wasn't my son standing there. It was Rebecca, my daughter-in-law. She was a petite woman with blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, her blue eyes sharp and assessing. She was wearing her nursing scrubs even though she was supposedly off-duty. She didn't hug me, she didn't step back to welcome me in. She stood in the doorway blocking the view inside, guarding the entrance like a warden. "You are late, Desmond," she said. Her voice was soft, the kind of professional softness nurses use when they have bad news, but her eyes were cold. "Terrence is already exhausted. We need to keep this visit short tonight. His vitals were unstable this afternoon." I checked my watch. I was exactly on time. I looked past her shoulder. "I am his father, Rebecca," I said, pushing past her gently but firmly. "I am not a guest. I am family." She stiffened but let me pass, closing the door behind me with a heavy thud that sounded like a prison cell locking. The air inside was stifling. The air conditioning was cranked up so high I could see my breath, yet the smell of sickness was thick enough to taste. And then I saw him. My son Terrence was in the living room, positioned in front of the television that wasn't turned on. He was sitting in a high-backed wheelchair, a blanket draped over his legs. I stopped dead in my tracks. It had only been 2 weeks since I last saw him, but the man in the chair looked like he had aged 20 years. Terrence used to be 6'3" of solid muscle. He ran his own construction firm. He could lift beams that 2 men struggled with. He had a laugh that could shake the windows. The thing sitting in that chair was a husk. His skin, usually a rich, healthy, deep brown, was now a terrifying shade of ashy gray. His cheeks were sunken in so deep I could see the shape of his skull. His eyes were open, but they were glassy, staring at nothing, floating in a sea of yellowed whites. "Terry," I whispered. I walked over and knelt beside the chair. "Son, it's Dad. I'm here." He didn't turn his head. His hand resting on the armrest twitched. I covered his hand with mine. His skin was cold and clammy like wet clay. I squeezed gently, looking for any sign of the strength that used to define him. There was nothing, just bone and loose skin. "What is happening to him?" I asked, my voice trembling with a rage I was trying to suppress. "He looks worse, Rebecca. He looks like he is fading away. Why aren't we taking him to the specialist in Boston? You said he was stabilizing." Rebecca was suddenly right beside me, her hand resting possessively on Terrence's shoulder. Her grip looked tight, too tight. "It is the progression of the disease, Desmond," she said with a sigh that sounded rehearsed. "I told you. It is a degenerative autoimmune condition. His body is attacking itself. We are doing everything we can. Dr. Miller said travel would kill him right now. He needs rest and his medication." Terrence let out a low groan. It was a sound of pure misery. I saw his lips move. I leaned in, close my ear, inches from his mouth. "Water," he croaked. The voice was like dry leaves scraping together. I reached for the glass on the side table, but Rebecca snatched it away before I could touch it. "No," she snapped. Then she softened her tone, flashing that artificial smile. He is on a strict fluid schedule, Desmond. If he drinks too much, his lungs fill up. You don't want him to drown, do you? I will give him his special nutrient shake in a moment. She was treating him like a specimen in a jar. She controlled his water. She controlled his movement. She controlled his voice. I looked at my son, a man who had built bridges and towers, now reduced to begging for a sip of water in his own house, and I felt a structural failure in my own heart. "Dinner is ready," Rebecca announced. "Let's eat. Leo is waiting." We moved to the dining room. Rebecca wheeled Terrence to the head of the table, locking the wheels with a loud click. My grandson Leo was already seated. He was 10 years old, a bright kid with curly hair and his father's nose. Usually Leo would run to me asking if I brought him any new engineering puzzles or if we could talk about the Knicks game. Tonight Leo didn't move. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his head bowed. He looked terrified. "Hey there, little engineer," I said, trying to force some warmth into the frozen room. "How is school?" Leo looked up for a split second. His eyes darted to his mother, then back to his empty plate. "Fine, Grandpa," he whispered. We ate in silence. The only sound was the scraping of silverware on china and the labored, wheezing breathing of my son at the head of the table. Rebecca had served a roast, but it was dry and tasteless. She spent the entire meal talking, filling the silence with a monologue about how hard it was to be a full-time caregiver, how much she sacrificed, how expensive the new treatments were. "It is just so draining," she said, taking a sip of red wine. "People don't understand the burden. Terrence requires 24-hour monitoring. I haven't slept in weeks, but I do it because I love him. I gave up my position as head nurse for this." She looked at me expecting praise, expecting gratitude. I looked at the wineglass in her hand and then at my dying son who wasn't allowed water. "You are a saint, Rebecca," I lied. My voice was flat. "I am a structural engineer. I know when a foundation is rotten. I was looking for the cracks." Terrence suddenly slumped to the side in his chair. His head lolled. A line of drool escaped his lips. "Oh, poor baby," Rebecca said, standing up briskly. "It is time for his medicine. The cocktail Dr. Miller prescribed. It helps him sleep. Desmond, finish your meal. I need to go to the kitchen to mix it. It has to be precise." She walked into the kitchen. I heard the sound of a blender whirring. This was the moment. The air in the room changed instantly. Leo stopped staring at his plate. He looked at his father, then at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic that no 10-year-old should ever know. "Leo," I whispered, "what is going on?" He didn't answer verbally. He reached into his pocket. His hand was shaking so bad he almost dropped his fork. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper no bigger than a stick of gum. He looked toward the kitchen door. The blender was still running. He jumped out of his chair and ran to me, throwing his arms around my neck as if he was hugging me goodbye. "Grandpa." He breathed into my ear, his voice barely a tremor. "Don't let her see. Take it. Please. Save him." He shoved the paper into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. He squeezed me tight, his small fingers digging into my back. Then he pulled away and sat back down just as the blender stopped. When Rebecca walked back in with a tall glass of thick greenish liquid, Leo was eating his peas and I was wiping my mouth with a napkin, my heart hammering against my ribs like a sledgehammer. "Time to go, Desmond," Rebecca said. She didn't ask. It was an order. "I need to administer this and then get him into bed. He gets agitated if there are visitors late at night." It was 6:45 p.m. I stood up. I walked over to Terrence. I kissed his forehead. His skin smelled like sweat and metal. "I love you, son," I said. "I am not giving up." He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the green liquid in Rebecca's hand with a look of pure terror. I walked to the door. Rebecca watched me leave her hand on the deadbolt before I was even down the steps. I heard the lock click, then the deadbolt slid home, then the chain. I walked to my truck, my legs feeling heavy and numb. The suburban street was quiet. Sprinklers were hissing on neighbors' lawns. Blue light from televisions flickered in windows. It was a normal Tuesday night for everyone else, but inside my pocket I felt the weight of the paper Leo had given me. I drove 3 blocks away and pulled into the parking lot of a closed pharmacy. I turned off the engine. My hands were shaking so hard I had trouble turning on the dome light. I pulled out the note. It was torn from a page of homework-lined paper with jagged edges. The handwriting was scrawled hurried, pressed hard into the paper. I read it, and the air left my lungs. Grandpa checked the storage unit Dad rented. Unit 385. The code is my birthday. You need to see what is inside before Friday. Mom says Dad will die on Friday. I stared at the words. Dad will die on Friday. Today was Tuesday. This wasn't a warning about a disease. This was a schedule. My grandson knew the date of his father's execution. I looked back toward the direction of the house. I thought about the green liquid Rebecca was forcing down Terrence's throat right now. I thought about the coldness in her eyes. I thought about the way she controlled the water. I started the truck. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the night. I wasn't going home. I was going to storage unit 385, and if anyone got in my way, God help them, because the engineer in me was done inspecting. It was time to start breaking things. I drove fast, the street lights blurring into streaks of orange light. The storage facility was on the edge of town, a place called Secure Keep. Terrence had rented a unit there years ago to store surplus construction materials. Tools, copper, wiring, things he didn't want sitting on job sites. I hadn't been there in years. I pulled up to the gate. It was a fortress of corrugated metal and barbed wire. I punched in Leo's birthday into the keypad. 0812. The light turned green. The gate slid open with a mechanical groan. I drove through the maze of identical metal doors until I found number 385. I parked the truck so the headlights pointed directly at the door. I grabbed the tire iron from under my seat. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't taking chances. The lock on the unit was a heavy-duty padlock, but I knew the combination. Terrence used the same code for everything. I spun the dial. The lock clicked open. I took a deep breath. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. I grabbed the handle of the roll-up door and heaved it upward. The metal door rattled and crashed as it rolled up. The headlights of my truck flooded the space, cutting through the darkness and the dust. I expected to see tools. I expected to see bags of cement, maybe some old furniture. I stepped forward, squinting against the glare. What I saw made me drop the tire iron. It hit the concrete with a clang that echoed in the silence. The unit wasn't a storage space. It was an office, a war room. In the center was a folding table covered in stacks of paper. But it wasn't the paperwork that made my knees buckle. Against the back wall, sitting on top of a stack of wooden pallets, was a large, polished mahogany box. It was a coffin, a brand new high-end casket, and taped to the lid was a piece of paper with a name printed in bold black marker. Terrence Bell. I gasped, the sound tearing out of my throat like a sob. I stumbled forward, my hand covering my mouth. Next to the coffin was a black suit pressed and wrapped in plastic hanging from a hook on the wall, a white shirt, a black tie. She had already bought his outfit. She had already bought his box. My son was still breathing, still fighting for every sip of water, and his wife had already packed him away for the ground. I turned to the table. I began frantically grabbing papers. They were letters, hundreds of them, unopened or torn open, bank statements, tax notices from the IRS, past due notices for the mortgage, letters from life insurance companies confirming policy changes, and then I saw the box in the corner. A cardboard box, overflowing with small glass vials. I picked one up. It was empty. The label had been peeled off, but I could still read the faint imprint on the glass. Insulin. Terrence was not diabetic. I looked around the room, my mind racing, connecting the structural beams of this nightmare. The smell of sickness, the weight loss, the autoimmune disease, the green shakes, the insulin vials, the financial notices, the coffin. This wasn't just a bad marriage. This was an assassination. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so violently I dropped it. As I bent down to pick it up, I saw something else under the table. A file folder labeled Medical History, Confidential. I opened it. These weren't Terrence's medical records. They were someone else's. A man named Michael Vance. I scanned the pages. Deceased 5 years ago. Cause of death, multi-organ failure due to complications from autoimmune disorder. I looked at the next page. It was a marriage certificate between Michael Vance and a woman named Becky. Rebecca. My blood ran cold. She had done this before. This was her blueprint. And my son was just the next project on her list. I grabbed the file. I grabbed a handful of the letters. I took a picture of the coffin. I knew I couldn't call the police yet. Not with Leo in that house. If she knew I was here, if she knew I knew, she might hurt the boy. Or she might accelerate the timeline. Friday was the deadline. Today was Tuesday. I had 3 days. I pulled down the door, locked the padlock, and got back in my truck. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I am a builder. I build things to last. But now I was going to have to tear something down. I was going to dismantle Rebecca's life brick by brick, lie by lie, and I was going to bury her under the rubble. I put the truck in gear. I wasn't going home to sleep. I was going to find the only man in this city who was dirtier than the devil herself. I was going to find Mr. Clay. The drive to the secure keep storage facility felt like a funeral procession of one. My old Ford truck rattled over the potholes of the industrial district, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in off the river. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through my spine, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the agony in my chest. I kept seeing Terrence's face as it was tonight, gaunt and gray, a skull wrapped in thin parchment skin. It was impossible to reconcile that image with the man my son actually was. Just 2 years ago on his wedding day, Terrence had been a mountain of a man. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds of solid muscle. He had been a linebacker in college, and he carried that strength into his construction business. I remember watching him lift heavy steel beams with a grin on his face, sweat glistening on his dark skin, looking like he could hold up the sky if he wanted to. He was vibrant. He was alive. He had a laugh that started deep in his belly and made everyone around him smile. He was the kind of man who never got sick. He didn't even get colds. Then came Rebecca. At first, the changes were subtle. A little fatigue here, a stomach ache there. We all brushed it off as stress from the business or the adjustment to married life. But then the weight started falling off him. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a cliff dive. Within 6 months of the wedding, he had lost 50 pounds. He stopped going to job sites. He stopped coming to Sunday dinners. Rebecca became his gatekeeper. She told us it was a rare autoimmune disorder. She used big medical words that shut us up. Polymyositis, systemic sclerosis. She was the head nurse, so who were we to argue? But driving through the dark tonight, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, I realized the timeline didn't match a disease. It matched a takeover. He didn't just get sick. He was being erased. The strong, laughing man I raised was being hollowed out from the inside, and tonight, looking at the terror in my grandson's eyes, I finally let myself think the thought I had buried for 2 years. This was not nature. This was engineering. Someone was dismantling my son piece by piece. I pulled up to the gate of the storage facility. It was a desolate place, rows of metal units surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The fluorescent security lights buzzed loudly in the silence, casting long, unnatural shadows across the concrete. I rolled down my window and punched the code Leo had given me into the keypad. 0812, Leo's birthday. The keypad beeped a harsh electronic sound that seemed too loud in the quiet night. The gate groaned and slowly slid open. I drove through, my heart hammering against my ribs like a sledgehammer. I felt like a criminal. I was a 69-year-old man, a retired engineer, a deacon at my church, and here I was breaking into a storage unit in the middle of the night. I parked the truck in front of Unit 385. I turned off the engine, but I left the headlights on, bathing the metal door in a stark white glare. I stepped out of the truck. The air here was cold and smelled of damp concrete, old dust, and rust. It was a lonely smell. I looked around, half expecting a security guard to jump out, or worse, to see Rebecca's car pull up behind me. But I was alone. Just me and the secrets my son had hidden away, or maybe the secrets hidden from him. I approached the lock. It was a heavy-duty padlock, the kind used for construction sites. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the set of spare keys Terrence had given me years ago for his job sites. I prayed he hadn't changed the locks. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get the key into the slot. Finally, it slid home. I turned it. The mechanism clicked. I pulled the lock off and hooked my fingers under the handle of the roll-up door. It was heavy. I grunted, engaging my legs and back lifting with the old strength I had left. The door rattled violently as it rolled up into the ceiling, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty facility. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring into the darkness of the unit. The truck headlights only illuminated the first few feet. I walked back to the truck, grabbed the heavy flashlight from the glove box, and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a space that was choked with dust. I expected to see tools. I expected to see surplus lumber bags of cement, maybe some old furniture Terrence wanted to keep. But the unit was almost empty of construction gear. Instead, it looked like an archive of a life gone wrong. In the center of the room was a cheap plastic folding table. It was buried under an avalanche of paper. I walked over and picked up a handful. They were letters, hundreds of them, and they were all unopened or torn open violently. I shined the light on the return addresses. Internal Revenue Service, Final Notice, Department of Water and Power, Shut-off Notice, First National Bank, Mortgage Default Warning. There were letters from suppliers threatening legal action for unpaid invoices. There were notices from credit card companies I didn't even know Terrence had. I felt a wave of nausea. Terrence prided himself on his credit. He paid his bills the day they arrived. He had a credit score of 800. I looked at the dates on the envelopes. The delinquency started 18 months ago, right around the time he got too sick to work, right around the time Rebecca took over the finances because, as she said, he needed to rest. She hadn't been paying the bills. She had been intercepting them. She had been hoarding the evidence of his ruin in this cold, dark metal box while she played the devoted wife at his bedside. I swept the light across the table and saw something that made me freeze. A cardboard box sat on the floor, overflowing with small glass vials and orange plastic prescription bottles. I crouched down my knees, popping, and picked one up. The label had been scraped off, but the residue was sticky against my thumb. I picked up another. This one still had a partial label. Digoxin. I frowned. Digoxin was heart medication. Terrence had a heart like an ox. He had never had heart trouble in his life. I dug deeper into the box. I found bottles of heavy sedatives, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and then, at the bottom, dozens of empty insulin vials. I held the small glass bottle up to the light. Insulin. Terrence was not diabetic. His blood sugar had always been perfect. Why would my son need gallons of insulin and heart medication? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow. He didn't need them. He was being fed them. I dropped the vial back into the box. It clinked against the others, the sound of glass on glass sounding like chattering teeth. This wasn't a storage unit. It was a crime scene. It was a dumping ground for the evidence of a slow-motion murder. She was poisoning him. She was drugging him to keep him weak, to simulate the symptoms of a disease that didn't exist, while she drained his accounts dry and let his business rot. I stood up, my head spinning. I needed to take pictures. I needed to document this. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb and clumsy. As I turned to get a better angle on the table, the beam of my flashlight swept across the back corner of the unit. I stopped. The light caught on something large and polished. It was sitting on top of two wooden pallets pushed all the way against the back wall, half covered by a dusty painter's drop cloth. I walked toward it slowly, my boots scuffing on the concrete floor. I reached out and pulled the drop cloth away. I gasped. The air rushed out of my lungs in a strangled, high-pitched sound that I didn't recognize as my own voice. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. It was a coffin. It was a magnificent high-end casket made of polished mahogany with gold handles. The wood gleamed under the harsh light of my flashlight. It was the kind of thing you buy for a head of state or a king, but it wasn't empty. Or rather, it wasn't waiting for a stranger. Taped to the lid of the coffin, right in the center, was a piece of white printer paper. On it, written in thick black permanent marker, was a name: Terrence Bell. I fell to my knees. My legs simply gave out. I stared at the name, the black letters swimming in my vision. She had bought it. She had already bought the box to put him in. Next to the coffin, hanging from a nail driven into the metal wall, was a garment bag. The plastic was clear. Inside was a black tuxedo, a crisp white shirt, a black silk tie, and down on the pallet a pair of black dress shoes polished to a shine. It was his funeral outfit. My son was still breathing. He was still fighting for every beat of his heart in that house just 5 miles away, and his wife had already dressed him for the grave. She had the coffin ready. She had the suit ready. She had the date ready. Friday. Leo's note screamed in my mind. Dad will die on Friday. This wasn't a prediction. It was an appointment. She was going to kill him on Friday because she was ready. The stage was set. The props were bought. The costume was hanging on the wall. I crawled forward on my hands and knees and touched the cold wood of the coffin. It felt like ice. It felt like death. I realized then why she was starving him, why she was denying him water, why he looked like a skeleton. She needed him to fit the narrative. She needed him to look like a man who had wasted away from a terrible disease, so that when she put him in this box on Friday, no one would ask questions. No one would ask for an autopsy. They would just say, "Oh, poor Rebecca, she took such good care of him, but the disease was too strong." I knelt there on the cold concrete floor of Unit 385, and I wept. I wept for the boy I taught to ride a bike. I wept for the man who built skyscrapers. And then the weeping stopped. A cold, hard rage took its place. It started in my gut and spread to my chest, my arms, my hands. It dried my tears and steadied my shaking. I stood up, I took my phone, and I started taking pictures. Flash, the coffin. Flash, the name tag. Flash, the suit. Flash, the box of drugs. Flash, the unpaid bills. I wasn't a father anymore. I was an engineer who had found the fault line, and I was going to bring the whole structure down on top of her head. I grabbed the box of vials. I grabbed a stack of the financial documents. I walked out of the unit, pulled the door down, and locked it. I got back into my truck. The engine roared to life. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 3 a.m. Friday was coming. But so was I. I drove straight to the one place in the city where the shadows were darker than the night itself. Mr. Clay lived and worked out of a basement apartment in a building that should have been condemned 10 years ago. He was a private investigator who had lost his license back in the 90s for breaking too many rules, but he was the man you went to when the law was too slow or too blind to help. I banged on his metal door, the sound echoing in the damp alleyway. It took a full minute before the peephole slid open. A bloodshot eye stared out at me. I held up the cash I had withdrawn from the ATM on the way over. The door unlocked with the heavy clank of 3 deadbolts sliding back. Clay was sitting in a leather armchair that was more duct tape than cowhide. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old coffee. He didn't offer me a seat. He just pointed to the table where I dumped the contents of the box I had stolen from the storage unit. I spread out the photos of the coffin, the empty insulin vials, the intercepted letters, and the file on Michael Vance. Clay picked up the photo of the coffin first. He stared at it for a long time, his face unreadable behind a cloud of smoke. Then he picked up the marriage certificate of Rebecca and her first husband. "You have a serious problem, Desmond," Clay said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "You are dealing with a black widow." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. A black widow. Clay continued explaining that these are the most dangerous kind of predators. They don't kill for passion. They kill for profit. They are patient. They are meticulous. They create a narrative of sickness to isolate the victim so that when death finally comes, everyone is expecting it. The coffin in the storage unit isn't just a purchase, it is a psychological trophy. It means she is so confident in her timeline that she is already planning the after-party. She has done this before Desmond. Michael Vance died of multi-organ failure 5 years ago. That is the medical term for body shutdown. It is what happens when you are slowly poisoned over months so that it looks like a natural decline. She got away with it once. She thinks she is invincible. We turned our attention to the medical records I had grabbed. Buried in the stack of unpaid bills were carbon copies of lab results from a clinic across town. Terrence must have gone there for a second opinion months ago before he became bedridden. Rebecca had intercepted the results. I laid them out next to the empty vials of digoxin and the heavy sedatives. The dates matched perfectly. Every time she refilled a prescription for these heart medications that he didn't need, his health took a nosedive. I looked at the numbers on the page, my engineering brain looking for the pattern. It was right there in black and white. Terrence did not have an autoimmune disease. His white blood cell count was normal until the dates coinciding with the drug purchases. She wasn't treating a disease. She was manufacturing one. The green shakes she forced down his throat were chemical cocktails designed to shut down his kidneys and liver slowly. It mimicked the symptoms of lupus or multiple sclerosis, but it was just good old-fashioned poisoning. I held up one of the empty bottles. Digoxin. It is a heart medication derived from the foxglove plant. It regulates heart rhythm, but if you give it to a healthy man, it causes nausea, confusion, weakness, and eventually cardiac arrest. She was dosing him right up to the edge of death, keeping him weak and compliant, waiting for the policy date or the foreclosure date to align. She wasn't nursing him. She was cultivating his death like a gardener tending a poisonous plant. The cruelty of it took my breath away. She watched him suffer every day. She wiped his brow. She held his hand. And all the while, she was the one pouring the poison down his throat. I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't care about the law. I didn't care about strategy. My son was dying in a house 5 miles away, and I had the proof in my hands. I grabbed the papers and ran back to my truck. The sun was just starting to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in colors that looked like bruises. I drove like a madman, running red lights, the tires screeching as I turned onto my son's street. I pulled up onto the lawn, leaving deep ruts in the perfect grass. I jumped out and ran to the front door. I didn't ring the bell. I pounded on the wood with my fist until the frame shook. "Open the door, Rebecca," I roared. "I know what you are doing. I know about the insulin. I know about the coffin. Open this door or I will break it down." The door swung open instantly. She was standing there fully dressed in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, holding a cup of tea. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. "You are disturbing the neighbors, Desmond," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "It is 6 in the morning." I pushed past her into the hallway. The smell of bleach was stronger than ever. "Get out of my way," I snarled. "I am taking my son to the emergency room right now. We are getting a real blood test. We are getting a toxicology screen." She stepped in front of me, blocking the path to the living room. Her small frame seemed to expand with a cold, dark energy. "You are not taking him anywhere," she said calmly. "You are trespassing." I tried to step around her, but she moved with surprising speed. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a folded document. She snapped it open in front of my face like a shield. "Read it, Desmond," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. "It is a medical power of attorney. It grants me full and exclusive control over Terrence's medical decisions, including transport treatment and end-of-life care." I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Terrence's name, but the handwriting was a jagged, illegible scrawl, like a spider dipped in ink scuttling across the page. It trailed off at the end as if the hand holding the pen had lost all strength. "He didn't sign this willingly," I shouted, my face inches from hers. "You drugged him. You forced his hand while he was high on sedatives. This is fraud. This is a death warrant." She laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Prove it. It is notarized. It is filed. And until a judge says otherwise, I own his body. Now get out of my house before I have you removed." I heard a low moan from the living room. "Dad." It was Terrence. He sounded so weak, like a ghost trapped in the walls. I lunged forward, shoving Rebecca aside. I needed to get to him. I needed to pick him up and carry him out of there. But before I could take 2 steps, the wail of sirens cut through the morning air. Blue and red lights flashed against the living room window. She had called them. She had called the police before I even arrived. She knew I was coming. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of the house. Officers swarmed up the walkway, their hands on their holsters. "Step away from the woman," one of the officers commanded, entering the hallway with his gun drawn. I threw my hands up. "Officer, please, you have to listen to me. She is killing him. She has a coffin in a storage unit. She is poisoning him with heart medication." But Rebecca was already in motion. The cold, arrogant woman vanished, replaced instantly by a weeping, terrified victim. She sobbed, big crocodile tears rolling down her cheeks. "He is senile, officer," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He has dementia. He has been harassing us for weeks. He thinks I am a spy. He thinks I am poisoning his son." He broke in. He pushed me. "I am terrified for my safety." The officer looked at me. I was disheveled, sweating, holding a fistful of stolen papers, screaming about coffins. Then he looked at her. The petite nurse in the clean house. "Sir," the officer said, his voice hard, "you need to calm down." I tried to show him the photos. "Look at this. Look at the coffin. Look at the insulin vials. Terrence isn't diabetic." The officer didn't even look at the photos. He looked at the medical proxy Rebecca was holding out to him. He scanned the document. He nodded to her. "Sir, this document is legal," the officer said, turning back to me. "Mrs. Bell has medical guardianship. You have no legal standing here. You are trespassing on private property and you are causing a disturbance. You need to leave the premises immediately or I will arrest you for assault and battery." "But he is dying," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Can't you hear him?" The officer stepped closer, getting in my face. "I am not going to ask you again. Walk to your truck or walk to a cell. I looked past the officer's shoulder. I looked toward the living room. I couldn't see Terrence, but I saw Leo. My grandson was standing at the top of the stairs. He was wearing his pajamas. His face was pressed against the banister. He wasn't crying. He was staring at me with a look of utter hopelessness. He had given me the note. He had given me the key. And I had failed. I lowered my hands. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a cold, heavy stone in my gut. I couldn't help Terrence from a jail cell. I needed to be free to fight another way. "I will leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and walked out the door. Rebecca stood in the entryway, wiping her fake tears. As I passed her, she leaned in close so only I could hear. "Friday," she whispered. "Don't be late for the funeral." I walked to my truck under the watchful eyes of the police. I started the engine and drove away, leaving my son in the care of his executioner. I had the truth, but she had the law, and the clock was ticking down to Friday. I sat on a milk crate in Clay's basement, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Clay slapped a thick file onto the table between us. The sound was heavy like a judge's gavel. He didn't look at me. He just started turning pages, his calloused finger tracing lines of red ink that looked more like arterial spray than accounting figures. Bell Construction was gone. My son's company, the legacy he had built from the ground up with sweat and grit, was a hollow shell. Clay walked me through the autopsy of the business. It wasn't a sudden collapse due to market forces or bad bids. It was a systematic extraction, a surgical removal of assets that had started 2 weeks after the wedding. "Look at this," Desmond Clay growled, pointing to a series of transfers. "She didn't just spend the money, she laundered it." I leaned in, squinting at the numbers. Every Friday, like clockwork, $5,000 was moved from the operating account to a vendor called Greenscape Solutions. I knew Terrence's vendors. He didn't have a landscaper on payroll. Clay flipped the page. Greenscape Solutions was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. From there, the money was converted into cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, Ethereum, untraceable digital ghosts. She had drained the equipment fund. She had liquidated the 401k accounts. She had even taken out loans against the heavy machinery, the excavators and bulldozers that were the heart of the business, and then sold the equipment for cash to overseas buyers. The yard was empty. The accounts were overdrawn. My son had been working himself to the bone, thinking he was keeping his head above water while his wife was drilling holes in the hull. Clay showed me the timeline. The biggest transfers coincided with the days Terrence was most incapacitated. When he was too weak to check his email, she was wiring 50 grand to an offshore account. When he was hallucinating from the drugs, she was signing over the titles to his work trucks. It was a masterclass in corporate theft, executed from a bedside table. But the worst part wasn't the theft. It was the malice. She hadn't just stolen the profit. She had not paid the insurance premiums. She had let the liability coverage lapse. If a worker had gotten hurt on a job site in the last 6 months, Terrence would have been personally liable. She was setting him up for lawsuits, for bankruptcy, for prison. She wasn't just killing his body, she was obliterating his name. She wanted him to die a failure. She wanted his obituary to read that he was a broke, incompetent businessman who lost everything, so that no one would look too closely at the widow who walked away with the hidden millions. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I thought I knew the extent of her greed, but this was bottomless. She had eaten him alive. Clay closed the folder. "There is more, Desmond." He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a property deed. But it wasn't for Terrence's house. It was for mine. My house. The 2-story brick colonial in the suburbs where I raised Terrence, where my wife and I had planted the oak tree in the front yard, the house I had paid off 15 years ago. I stared at the document. It was a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit taken out 6 months ago for $300,000. And there at the bottom was my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. It was a shaky, jagged imitation. It looked like the signature on Terrence's medical proxy. "She forged my name," I whispered. The room seemed to tilt. "She didn't just forge it," Clay said. "She had Terrence co-sign as a witness. Look at his signature." I looked. It was barely a scratch. It was the mark of a man who didn't know what he was signing or who was too drugged to care. She had used my dying son's hand to rob his own father. "The bank has already started foreclosure proceedings," Clay said, his voice devoid of pity. "You missed the last 4 payments. You didn't receive the notices because the mailing address was changed to a P.O. box in Rebecca's name." I was homeless. I just didn't know it yet. Everything I had worked for, every beam I had designed, every bridge I had inspected to ensure my pension was secure, it was all gone. She had taken my past, my present, and my future. She had leveraged my home to buy the poison she was using to kill my son. The irony was so sharp, it felt like a physical puncture wound. I was financing the murder of my own child. I sat there, the realization washing over me. I had thought I was the cavalry coming to the rescue, but I was just another victim. I was a structural engineer standing in the rubble of a building that had been demolished months ago. I just hadn't heard the explosion. My phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a scream. I looked at the screen. It was Rebecca. I hesitated. My instinct was to throw the phone against the wall, but I needed to know. I needed to hear the voice of the monster. I answered. I didn't say hello. I just held the phone to my ear and breathed. Desmond. Her voice floated through the speaker. It was sweet, syrupy, dripping with fake concern. It was the voice she used for the doctors and the neighbors. I just wanted to update you on Terrence. I said nothing. My hand gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Dr. Miller was just here, she continued, the sweetness curdling into something darker. He says Terrence is very weak. His organs are shutting down, Desmond. It is the final stage. We don't think he will make it through the weekend. She paused, waiting for me to sob, waiting for me to break. When I stayed silent, her tone shifted. The mask slipped. The voice that came next was cold, flat, and terrifyingly amused. You should probably get your suit ready, Desmond. The black one. You will need it for Friday. And maybe pack a bag while you're at it. Why? I rasped. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger. Well, I saw a notice from the bank today, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It looks like the bank is taking your house, Desmond. It is such a shame. Terrible financial management runs in the family, I suppose. First Terrence, now you. It is tragic, really. She knew I knew, and she didn't care. She was gloating. She was standing over the bodies of the men she had destroyed and laughing. You won't get away with this, Rebecca, I said. Oh, Desmond, she laughed. It was a light tinkling sound. I already have. The house is mine, the insurance is mine, and Terrence is mine. Don't come by the house tonight. We want his last hours to be peaceful. Goodbye, Dad. The line went dead. I sat there for a second, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. The rage that had been building in my gut since I found the coffin, the anger that had been simmering since the police kicked me out, it all coalesced into a singularity. It was a dense, heavy point of absolute fury. I looked at the phone in my hand. It was a connection to her. It was the device she used to taunt me. I stood up and hurled the phone against the brick wall of the basement. It shattered. Plastic and glass exploded, skittering across the concrete floor. The battery spun away under a cabinet. The noise was satisfying. It was final. Clay didn't flinch. He just took a drag of his cigar and watched me. I wasn't shaking anymore. The panic was gone. The grief was gone. The helplessness was gone. I was an engineer. When a structure is compromised, you don't patch it. You don't paint over the cracks. You bring it down. You use controlled demolition. You place the charges at the critical load-bearing points and you blow it to hell. Rebecca thought she had won because she had the money and the law. But she had made a fatal error. She had left me with nothing to lose. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous force on earth. I looked at Clay. Get your team, I said. My voice was steady. It was cold. It was the voice of a man who was done building and ready to start destroying. We are going to take her down, I said, and we are going to do it before Friday. Clay smiled. It was a wolfish grin that showed his yellow teeth. That will cost you extra, Desmond. I don't care, I said. I will burn the whole world down if I have to. Just get me into that house. Clay sat behind his desk, his face illuminated by the blue glow of 3 computer monitors. The air in the basement was stagnant heavy with the scent of old dust and the cheap cigars he chain-smoked. I stood on the other side of the desk, watching his eyes dart across the screens. He had been digging for 2 hours, following the digital breadcrumbs left behind by the woman who called herself Rebecca Bell. He finally stopped typing and looked up at me. His expression was grim. You were right, Desmond, he said, his voice a low rumble. She is not who she says she is. In fact, Rebecca Bell does not exist. The woman in your son's house, the woman poisoning him by the hour, was born Becky Lynn Sawyer in a trailer park outside of Reno, Nevada 35 years ago. Clay turned the monitor so I could see. There was a mugshot from 15 years ago. It was her. Younger with darker hair and harder eyes, but it was undeniably her. She had been arrested for petty theft and forgery. The charges were dropped likely because she charmed her way out of them, but her fingerprints were in the system. She is a ghost. Desmond Clay continued scrolling through a timeline he had constructed. After Reno, she disappeared. She resurfaced 5 years later in Arizona under the name Rebecca Vance. Then she moved to Texas as Rebecca Stone. And 2 years ago, she came here and became Rebecca Bell. She changes her last name like other people change their socks. She moves from state to state, always targeting mid-sized cities, always looking for men who are established but isolated. Men with assets, but without a large circle of protective family. I looked at the timeline. It was a map of predation. She didn't just move, she hunted. She found men who were strong men, who were builders and providers, and she latched onto them. She played the role of the nurturing nurse, the perfect partner who could take care of them. And then once the ring was on her finger and the papers were signed, the decline began. Clay pulled up a series of financial records. She has credit cards in 4 different names. She has bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Belize. The money she stole from Terrence's company didn't just disappear into the ether. It went into a labyrinth of shell companies she set up years ago. She is not a desperate housewife stealing grocery money. She is a professional financial predator. She knows how to hide assets better than most cartel accountants. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest. My son thought he had found love. He thought he had found a partner to build a life with. Instead, he had married a parasite that had been refining its feeding technique for a decade. She had studied him. She had calculated his worth. And she had decided exactly how long it would take to consume him completely. Clay clicked on a folder named Arizona. This is where it gets ugly, Desmond. You need to brace yourself. He opened a file. It was a death certificate. The name on it was Michael Vance. I remembered the file I had found in the storage unit. This was the man, the first husband. Clay began to read the details, his voice flat and clinical. Michael Vance was a cattle rancher outside of Tucson. He was 45 years old, healthy as a horse. He married Rebecca in 2012. 2 years later, he was dead. I leaned in reading the cause of death highlighted on the screen. Multi-organ failure secondary to rapid onset autoimmune complications. It was the exact same script. Clay pulled up the medical examiner's notes. Mr. Vance presented with extreme weight loss, muscle atrophy, and confusion. His wife, a registered nurse, provided end-of-life care at home. No autopsy was performed at the request of the widow who cited religious reasons. The local coroner signed off on it because Vance's medical records showed a steep decline over 6 months. She killed him, I whispered. The realization was a physical weight pressing on my lungs. She did the exact same thing to him. Clay nodded. She didn't just kill him. She harvested him. 2 weeks after the funeral, Rebecca Vance cashed a life insurance check for $2 million. She sold the ranch. She sold the equipment. She liquidated every asset Michael Vance had. Within 3 months, she was gone. She vanished from Arizona with $2 million in clean cash and left nothing behind but a grave. But here is the kicker, Clay said, pointing to a bank statement from 2015. That $2 million is gone. She burned through it. High-stakes gambling in Vegas, luxury trips to Dubai, bad investments in tech startups. She lives like a queen until the money runs out and then she goes hunting again. She was broke when she met Terrence. That was why she targeted him. She needed a new host. She needed fresh blood. Clay opened another window. He pulled up a list of pharmacy records from Tucson during the time of Michael Vance's illness. Digoxin, insulin, benzodiazepines. The list was identical to the empty bottles I found in the storage unit. She wasn't treating a disease. She was executing a recipe. She had perfected the dosage. She knew exactly how much poison to administer to mimic a natural decline without killing the victim too quickly. She needed time to transfer the assets. She needed time to isolate the victim from his family. I looked at the face of Michael Vance in an old newspaper clipping Clay had found. He was a smiling man with a cowboy hat standing next to a prize bull. He looked strong. He looked happy. He looked like my son. I slammed my fist onto the desk. We have to stop her, Clay. We have to call the police in Arizona. We have to exhume the body. Clay shook his head. Arizona is a cold case. The body has been in the ground for 10 years. The evidence is dust. And even if we could get them to open an investigation, it would take months. We don't have months. We don't even have days. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a document I had brought from the storage unit. It was the life insurance policy for Terrence. This is the gun to his head, Desmond. I looked at the policy. It was a term life insurance plan valued at $5 million. It was a massive policy, one that Terrence must have taken out to secure the business loans or perhaps at Rebecca's insistence. Clay pointed to the effective dates. Look at the expiration. I squinted at the fine print. The policy was a 5-year term. It was set to expire on October 14th, this Friday, at midnight. If Terrence is alive on Saturday morning, the policy lapses. The premiums haven't been paid in 6 months because she drained the accounts. The insurance company sent a grace period notice, but that grace period ends on Friday. If he dies after Friday, the payout is 0. She gets nothing. But if he dies on Friday before midnight, the policy pays out in full, $5 million. That was the deadline. That was why Leo wrote the note. That was why the coffin was ready. She couldn't afford to wait for the poison to finish him off naturally. She had run out of time. She had miscalculated the funds, or perhaps the poison worked slower on Terrence's strong heart than she expected. She was pushed against a wall. She needed him dead by Friday night, or her entire plan would collapse. She would be left with a bankrupt business, a foreclosed house, and a living husband who might eventually recover and ask questions. For a predator like Rebecca, that wasn't an option. She is going to accelerate the process, Clay said, echoing my thoughts. She can't rely on the slow drip of digoxin anymore. It is too unpredictable. She needs a guaranteed event. She is going to overdose him, I said, the bile rising in my throat. She is going to give him a massive bolus of insulin or stop his heart with potassium. She will make it look like his heart finally gave out from the strain of the disease. Clay nodded. She has the death certificate ready to be signed. She has the cremation arranged immediately to destroy the evidence. She has the narrative set. The grieving widow who stayed by his side until the tragic end. Friday was 3 days away. But I knew she wouldn't wait until the last minute. She would want a buffer. She would do it on Friday morning or maybe even Thursday night to ensure the paperwork was filed before the deadline. We are watching a countdown, Clay said, and we are the only ones who can see the clock. I stood up. The anger I felt was different now. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of before. It was cold. It was precise. It was the kind of focus you have when you are defusing a bomb. She wants a tragedy, I said. I am going to give her a war. Clay lit a fresh cigar. His eyes narrowed. What is the plan, Desmond? I looked at the photo of my son dying in his wheelchair. I looked at the photo of the coffin waiting in the dark. She thinks she is the only one who can play dirty, I said. She thinks she is the only one with a secret history. But she forgot one thing. What is that, Clay asked. She forgot that before I was an engineer, I was a father. And a father protects his own, even if he has to burn the whole world down to do it. I need you to find someone, Clay. Who? I pointed to the marriage certificate of Michael Vance. I pointed to the witness line. There was a signature there. A woman's name. Sarah Vance, his sister Clay said. Find her, I said. If Rebecca killed her brother, she has been waiting 10 years for a phone call. Bring her here. We are going to need a ghost to catch a ghost. Clay nodded and reached for his phone. I checked my watch. The sun was fully up now. The city was waking up. But in that house on the hill, my son was slipping away. I had to get back to him. But I couldn't just knock on the door again. I needed a way in. I needed eyes inside that fortress. I thought of Leo, my terrified, brave grandson. He was trapped in there with her. He was my only link. I am going to the school, I told Clay. I am going to get Leo. If she tries to stop me, I will cause a scene that will make the morning news. Clay grabbed my arm. Careful, Desmond. If you push her too hard before we are ready, she might panic. A panicked killer is sloppy, but they are also fast. If she thinks the walls are closing in, she might decide that today is Friday. I pulled my arm away. Then we better move fast. I left the basement and stepped into the blinding light of the morning. The clock was ticking. Every second was a drop of poison in my son's veins. I got into my truck and drove toward the elementary school. It was time to break the rules. It was time to save my family. I was sitting in my truck outside the elementary school waiting for the dismissal bell when my phone vibrated against my thigh. It was a single short buzz, but in the silence of the cab it felt like a gunshot. I pulled the phone out. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew immediately who it was. The message was short and terrifying. "Grandpa, help. Mom locked me in my room. She is mixing the blue medicine in the kitchen. She says Dad needs a big sleep today." The phone almost slipped from my sweating hands. Blue medicine. For the last 6 months the shakes had been green. Green was for the slow decline. Green was for the wasting away. Blue was new. Blue was different. My engineering mind raced through the possibilities. Blue could be anything, but in the context of a woman who had mastered the art of chemical murder, blue meant acceleration. It meant she was done waiting. She says Dad needs a big sleep. The phrase chilled me to the bone. It was the kind of euphemism you use with a child right before you put the family dog down. But she wasn't talking about a dog. She was talking about my son, and she wasn't waiting for Friday anymore. My visit this morning had spooked her. She knew I was onto her. She knew I had seen the medical proxy, and she likely suspected I had been to the storage unit. A predator like Rebecca doesn't wait around when the grass starts rustling. She strikes. I looked at the time. It was 10:15 a.m. Leo should be in his third period math class. If he was texting me about the kitchen, it meant he wasn't in school. She had kept him home. She was keeping the witness close. She was locking down the facility. I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the gas. The tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot. I needed to verify this. I needed to be sure she had pulled him out of school before I went crashing back into that house. If I went back there and Leo was actually safe in class, she would use it as the final nail in my coffin. She would say I was delusional, she would say I was dangerous, and the police would believe her. I drove the truck up onto the curb right in front of the school administration building. I didn't care about the fire lane. I didn't care about the crossing guard yelling at me. I jumped out and ran into the main office. The air conditioning hit me cool and smelling of floor wax and pencil shavings. It was the smell of normalcy, of safety, and it felt completely alien to the nightmare I was living. I slammed my hand on the reception counter. The secretary, a woman with glasses on a chain and a face that looked like it was carved out of granite, looked up at me over her bifocals. "I need to see Leo Bell," I said, my voice breathless. "He is in the 4th grade. It is an emergency." The woman didn't blink. She didn't type on her computer. She just folded her hands on the desk and looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Mr. Bell," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced. "Mrs. Bell called us this morning. She informed us that there might be an incident today." My stomach dropped. She had gotten ahead of me again. She was always 3 moves ahead. "What did she tell you?" I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. "She told us that Leo would be absent today due to a family matter," the secretary said. "She also informed us that his grandfather was having a severe mental health crisis and might attempt to remove the child from school grounds." I felt the blood rush to my face. A mental health crisis. She was painting me as the villain in every corner of this town. She was insulating herself with my own alleged insanity. "She is lying," I shouted. The receptionist flinched and reached for the phone. I lowered my voice, forcing myself to sound rational. "Please, you have to listen to me. Leo is in danger. His father is dying and his mother is the one doing it. She kept him home so he couldn't talk. I need you to call the police. I need you to send a welfare check to the house." The secretary picked up the receiver, but she wasn't dialing 911. She was looking at me with fear now. "Sir, you need to leave," she said firmly. "Mrs. Bell provided us with a copy of the restraining order application. She has full custody. If you do not leave, I will have to call the school resource officer. Restraining order application." It wasn't even a judge-signed order yet, but it was enough to turn the bureaucracy against me. She used the system like a weapon. She knew exactly which forms to file and which buzzwords to use to make people look away. I looked at the door to the inner offices. I wanted to run past her. I wanted to check the classrooms myself, but I knew it was useless. Leo wasn't here. The text message proved it. He was trapped in that house of horrors with a woman who was mixing a blue cocktail of death. "I am leaving," I said, backing away. "But you remember this. You remember that I came here and told you he was in danger. When you see his face on the news, you remember that you let him stay home." I turned and ran out of the school. I didn't look back. I had my answer. Leo was a prisoner, and the clock had just jumped forward. It wasn't days anymore. It was hours, maybe minutes. I drove to Terrence's house. I parked the truck 2 houses down, hidden behind a large hedge. I couldn't go to the front door again. The police had warned me. If they saw my truck in the driveway, they would arrest me on sight. And I couldn't help my son if I was in handcuffs. I crept through the neighbor's yard, moving through the shrubbery like a soldier in enemy territory. I knew the layout of the neighborhood. I knew the sight lines. I made my way to the side of Terrence's property where a tall oak tree cast a shadow over the side yard. I crouched behind a bush and looked up at the second floor. That was where Leo's room was. The window faced the side yard. The house was silent. The blinds were drawn on the first floor. It looked like a tomb. Then I saw movement. The curtains in Leo's room twitched. A small hand pressed against the glass. Then a face appeared. It was Leo. He looked terrified. His face was pale and streaks of tears had dried on his cheeks. He saw me down in the bushes. His eyes widened. He pressed both hands against the glass and mouthed a word. "Help." I stood up from my crouching position. I didn't care who saw me now. I stepped out onto the grass and looked up at him. I raised my hand. I tried to signal him to open the window. If he could open it, maybe I could climb the trellis. Maybe I could get him out. Leo fumbled with the latch. He was trying to push the sash up, but it wouldn't budge. She had nailed it shut, or maybe she had installed child locks. He banged on the glass with his small fist. He was screaming something, but the double-paned glass swallowed the sound. I could see his mouth moving. "Dad is sleeping. Dad is sleeping." My heart hammered. Sleeping. Was it the final sleep? Had she already given him the blue medicine? I took a step toward the house, calculating the climb. I could break the window. I could get him out. And then a shadow fell over Leo. Rebecca appeared behind him. She moved silently like a wraith. One moment Leo was alone, and the next her hands were on his shoulders. She wasn't rough. That was the most terrifying part. She touched him gently, almost lovingly. She pulled him back from the glass. Leo fought her. He thrashed in her grip, reaching for me, but she was strong. She spun him around, and I saw her say something to him. Leo went limp. He stopped fighting. He looked defeated. Then Rebecca looked out the window. She looked right at me. She knew I was there. She had probably been watching me creep through the yard the entire time. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked bored. She stared down at me with eyes that were as dead as shark eyes. She raised one hand and gave me a small, mocking wave. It was a gesture of total dominance. It was her way of saying, "I have your son. I have your grandson. And you are just an old man standing in the dirt." She reached for the cords of the blinds. "Don't you do it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Rebecca, look at me." She smiled. It was a cold, thin curling of her lips. Then she pulled the cord. The blinds snapped shut. The white slats closed with a finality that felt like a guillotine blade dropping. The house was sealed. The witness was silenced. The executioner had gone back to work. I stood there in the yard, staring at the blank white window. I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal roar of grief and rage. My son was in there dying. My grandson was in there watching it happen. And I was outside, separated by a thin sheet of glass and a legal system that protected the monster instead of the victims. I fell to my knees in the grass. The despair washed over me, heavy and suffocating. I had failed. I had let her win. But as my hand hit the ground, my fingers brushed against something hard in my pocket. The burner phone Clay had given me. I pulled it out. I looked at the dark screen. No, I wasn't done. She had won the battle of the morning. She had won the legal skirmish. But she hadn't won the war. She thought closing the blinds made her safe. She thought hiding in the dark made her invisible. But she forgot that I was an engineer. I knew how to bring light into dark places. And I knew that every structure, no matter how fortified, has a breaking point. I stood up. I dusted the dirt off my knees. I looked at the closed window one last time. "Enjoy the darkness while you can, Rebecca," I whispered, "because I am about to bring the fire." I turned and walked back to the truck. I wasn't going to the police. I wasn't going to a lawyer. I was going back to the basement. I was going to get the sample. I was going to get the blood. And if I had to tear that house apart with my bare hands to get to my son, then that is exactly what I would do. The time for following rules was over. The time for survival was now. I drove to the back entrance of St. Jude's Hospital where Dr. Marcus Evans was waiting for me by the loading dock. Marcus and I went back 40 years. We played high school football together, and while I went on to build bridges, he went on to fix broken bodies. He was the chief of toxicology, now a man who had seen every overdose and accidental poisoning in the city for the last 3 decades. If anyone could tell me what was in the glass vial I had snatched from the storage unit trash, it was him. I handed him the small glass bottle wrapped in a handkerchief. Marcus didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why I looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, or why I was handing him medical waste in a parking lot. He just looked at my eyes, saw the desperation there, and nodded. "Follow me," he said. We walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital basement to his private lab. It was quiet here, the hum of refrigerators and centrifuges the only sound. Marcus put on a pair of latex gloves and placed the vial under a fume hood. He used a pipette to extract the tiny drop of residue left at the bottom of the glass. He transferred it to a slide and then into a mass spectrometer. I stood by the door, my arms crossed, watching the machine hum. I felt like I was waiting for a verdict in a murder trial where the victim was still breathing. I thought about the blue medicine Leo had mentioned. I thought about the green shakes. I thought about the way Terrence looked like a man whose very essence was being drained out of him. The machine beeped. A printer whirred to life, spitting out a graph with jagged peaks and valleys. Marcus picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He stared at the results for a long time. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Desmond Marcus said finally. His voice was devoid of emotion, the voice of a scientist looking at data that didn't make sense. "Where did you get this?" "I found it in a box of supplies my daughter-in-law keeps," I said. "What is it, Marcus?" He turned to face me. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It is a cocktail," he said. "A very specific, very sophisticated, and very deadly cocktail. The base is digoxin. It is a cardiac glycoside used to treat heart failure, but in high doses it becomes a poison. It causes nausea, vomiting, confusion, and visual disturbances. It makes the patient see yellow halos around lights." I remembered Terrence squinting at the dining room light. I remembered him complaining about the glare. "But that is not all," Marcus continued. "The digoxin is just the vehicle. It weakens the heart. It lowers the blood pressure. It makes the victim lethargic and compliant. But the real killer is what she mixed with it." He pointed to a sharp spike on the graph. "Arsenic," he said. I felt the blood drain from my face. Arsenic. It sounded like something from an old mystery novel. It didn't belong in the 21st century. "It is an odorless, tasteless semi-metal," Marcus explained. "It is highly toxic. But here is the evil genius of it, Desmond. She is not giving him a single fatal dose. She is microdosing him. She is giving him just enough to cause chronic arsenic poisoning. The symptoms are vague: muscle weakness, skin pigmentation changes, weight loss. Peripheral neuropathy, which means numbness in the hands and feet. It mimics autoimmune diseases," I whispered. "Exactly," Marcus said. "It looks like lupus. It looks like ALS. It looks like a dozen natural causes that a doctor wouldn't question if he wasn't looking for poison. The arsenic slowly destroys the kidneys and the liver. It shuts down the body's ability to produce energy. It is a slow, agonizing suffocation of the cells." I leaned against the lab bench, nausea rolling in my stomach. She was torturing him. She wasn't just killing him. She was torturing him. Every day she handed him that glass, she was burning him from the inside out. "And the blue medicine?" I asked. "My grandson said she mixed a blue medicine today." Marcus looked at the chart again. He tapped a secondary reading. Methylene blue, he surmised. Or maybe a sedative dyed blue to mark the final phase. If she is switching to a new color, it likely means she is introducing a potentiator. Something to accelerate the heart failure caused by the digoxin. If the arsenic has weakened his organs enough, a massive dose of digoxin now would stop his heart instantly. It would look like sudden cardiac arrest brought on by the chronic illness. "She is finishing him off," I said. Marcus nodded. "If she administered a high dose today, Desmond, his heart won't last 48 hours. It might not last 24. The arsenic has prepped the ground. The digoxin is the match." I looked at the graph. It was a death sentence printed on thermal paper. "This is it," I said. "This is the proof. We can go to the police. We can show them this." Marcus shook his head slowly. His face was filled with regret. "We can't, Desmond." "What do you mean we can't?" I shouted. "It is right there. Arsenic, digoxin. She is poisoning him." "Desmond, listen to me," Marcus said, gripping my shoulder. "This is residue from a vial you found in a trash can in a storage unit. There is no chain of custody. A defense attorney would tear this apart in seconds. They would say you planted it. They would say it was old rat poison. They would say it proves nothing about what is currently inside Terrence's body." But I know I pleaded. "Knowing isn't proving," Marcus said. "To stop her, to get a judge to sign an emergency order, to get the police to kick down that door before he dies, you need biological evidence. You need to prove the poison is in his blood right now." "I need a blood sample," I said. "Yes," Marcus said. "If you can get me 5 milliliters of his blood or even a urine sample, I can run an official toxicology screen. I can prove the levels are lethal. I can prove acute poisoning. With that, the police can arrest her immediately. But without it, it is just your word against a grieving wife." I stared at the white tiles of the floor. I needed blood. I needed to walk into the fortress of a woman who had already called the police on me, a woman who had locked down the house, and I needed to stick a needle in my dying son's arm. And I had to do it before his heart stopped. Because once he died, she would have him cremated within hours. She had the medical proxy. She controlled the body. If he turned to ash, the evidence of the arsenic turned to ash with him. Arsenic stays in hair and bones, but fire destroys the soft tissue evidence of digoxin. And if she mixed the ashes, we would never be able to prove cause of death. Friday was the deadline for the insurance, but the deadline for the evidence was the moment his heart stopped beating. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 p.m. Leo said she was giving him the blue medicine this morning. That meant the clock was ticking faster than I thought. "Give me a kit," I said to Marcus. He looked at me. "Desmond, if you go back there, you will be arrested. You might get hurt." "Give me the kit, Marcus," I repeated. "I am an engineer. I solve problems. The problem is the poison is inside him. The solution is I have to get it out." Marcus sighed. He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a phlebotomy kit, a tourniquet, a butterfly needle, 2 vacutainer tubes, an alcohol wipe. He handed it to me. "Do you remember how to do this?" I nodded. Terrence had needed allergy shots when he was a kid. I learned how to give injections. Drawing blood was different, but the principle was the same. Find the vein, stick the needle, get the fluid. Be fast, Marcus said. The digoxin makes the heart erratic. If he is stressed, he could code. You have to be gentle, but you have to be quick. I took the kit and put it in my jacket pocket. Thank you, Marcus. I walked out of the hospital into the afternoon sun. The world looked too bright, too normal. People were walking their dogs. Cars were waiting at red lights. Nobody knew that a few miles away, a man was dissolving from the inside out. I got into my truck. I placed the tire iron on the passenger seat next to me. I wasn't going to knock this time. I wasn't going to ask nicely. Rebecca had used the law as a shield. She had used the police as her personal security guards. She thought the rules protected her. But she forgot that laws are for people who want to live in a society. I didn't want to live in her society anymore. I wanted to live in a world where my son was alive. I checked my phone. No new messages from Leo. That terrified me more than anything. Silence meant she had total control. I drove toward the house. I wasn't going to park down the street this time. I was going to park in the driveway. I was going to break the window. I was going to fight my way to his bedroom, and I was going to get that blood. It was a suicide mission. I knew that. If the police caught me, I would go to prison for breaking and entering assault, maybe worse. Rebecca would spin it as a violent home invasion by an estranged father. She would play the victim on the evening news. But I didn't care. If I could get the blood to Marcus before they cuffed me, it wouldn't matter. The blood would speak for me. The blood would scream the truth so loud that no lie Rebecca told could drown it out. I gripped the steering wheel. I felt the cool plastic of the phlebotomy kit in my pocket. It was the only weapon that mattered. "I am coming, son," I whispered to the empty cab. "Just hold on. Don't let the blue medicine win." I turned onto the main road. The sun was beginning to dip lower. The shadows were getting longer. Darkness was coming, and I was bringing it with me. The warehouse smelled of diesel and old iron, a scent that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it smelled like war. Clay had called in his markers. 3 men stood around a makeshift table made of plywood and sawhorses. They were not young men, but they were hard men. They were the kind of men who had seen things in deserts and jungles that made breaking into a suburban house feel like a walk in the park. One was a former combat medic named Miller who carried a bag that looked ominously like the one Rebecca used, but his was for saving lives, not ending them. The other two were brothers, large men with hands the size of shovels who Clay introduced simply as the movers. We laid out the blueprints of my son's house. I had built the deck myself. I had reinforced the foundation. I knew every beam, every joist, and every entry point. I pointed to the back patio door. It was a sliding glass door with a simple latch lock, but Rebecca had installed a secondary security bar and a magnetic alarm sensor. Clay traced the line of the electrical conduit. "We cut the power here," he said, tapping a spot near the garage. "The backup battery for the alarm will kick in, but we have a bypass for the cellular dialer. She won't get a call out to the police. The alarm will scream, but by the time the neighbors wake up, we will be inside." This was not a rescue mission anymore. It was a tactical extraction. We weren't just going to get Terrence. We were going to secure the evidence, neutralize the threat, and get out before the local police could arrest us for home invasion. Clay handed me a heavy tactical vest. "Put this on," he said. "Rebecca has a gun. I saw the registration. A .38 special. If she gets cornered, she will use it." I strapped the vest on. It felt heavy, restrictive, but it also felt like armor. I touched the phlebotomy kit in my pocket. That was my weapon. Miller checked his watch. "We move at 2300 hours, he said. "That gives her time to settle in for the night, but not enough time to finish whatever she started this morning." The atmosphere in this warehouse was charged with a cold professional tension. These men didn't know Terrence, they didn't know me, but they knew Clay, and they knew a bad situation when they saw one. They checked their gear, flashlights, zip ties, a pry bar, a glass cutter. It looked like the inventory of a heist movie, but the prize wasn't diamonds. It was a dying man. I looked at these strangers preparing to commit a felony for my son, and I felt a surge of gratitude that almost brought me to my knees. We weren't just a group of old men anymore. We were a wrecking ball headed for Rebecca's perfectly constructed life. We parked the van a block away from the house, hidden under the canopy of the old elm trees that lined the street. The rain had started to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the streets and blurred the streetlights. It was perfect cover. The sound of the rain would mask our footsteps. I lay in the wet grass of the neighbor's yard, the high-powered binoculars pressed to my eyes. My elbows sank into the mud, but I didn't feel the cold. All I felt was the burning heat of the scene unfolding in the master bedroom window on the second floor. The blinds were drawn, but not all the way. There was a 2-inch gap at the bottom, just enough for me to see into the room that had become my son's torture chamber. The room was lit by a single bedside lamp casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. I saw the hospital bed Rebecca had rented, and in it, I saw Terrence. He was propped up on pillows, his head lolling to the side. He looked smaller than he had even 2 days ago. He looked like a pile of laundry that someone had forgotten to fold. Rebecca moved into the frame. She was wearing a silk robe, moving with an eerie calmness. She held an IV bag in one hand and a syringe in the other. The liquid in the syringe was bright electric blue. My breath hitched into my throat. This was it, the blue medicine. I watched helpless as she injected the blue liquid into the port of the IV bag hanging above the bed. She didn't rush. She didn't look over her shoulder. She squeezed the plunger down with a steady, practiced thumb. The blue plume swirled into the clear saline, mixing, diluting, and then beginning its slow drip down the tube. It traveled down the line, a snake made of plastic and poison, until it disappeared into the catheter in my son's arm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash through the window, but Clay's hand was on my shoulder, heavy and restraining. "Not yet," he whispered. "We need her away from the bed. If we go in now, she could pull the line or inject an air bubble. We have to wait until she leaves the room or falls asleep." I watched the monitor. Terrence's body reacted almost instantly. He arched his back, a spasm seizing his wasted muscles. His mouth opened in a silent cry. His hands clawed at the sheets. Rebecca didn't call for help. She didn't check his vitals. She just stood there watching him thrash. She reached out and smoothed his hair, a gesture that looked tender but was actually checking his temperature. She looked at her watch. Then she picked up a notebook from the nightstand and wrote something down. She was taking notes. She was documenting the effectiveness of the dose. The convulsions stopped after a minute. Terrence slumped back into the pillows, his chest heaving. He was still alive, but barely. The blue poison was inside him now. The clock wasn't ticking down days anymore. It was ticking down heartbeats. Rebecca turned off the bedside lamp. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the heart monitor. She walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. "She is going to sleep," I whispered to Clay. "She thinks it is done. She thinks she can just wake up tomorrow and find a corpse." Clay signaled to the team. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the van. It was time. We weren't waiting for Friday. We were canceling Friday. The house went dark. The only light came from the digital clock on the microwave in the kitchen, visible through the back patio door. It read 2 a.m. Rebecca had been in the guest room down the hall for an hour. The lights were out. The house was a sleeping beast, its belly full of secrets and poison. We moved across the backyard in a tactical line. Miller took the lead, moving with a silent grace that belied his size. He reached the utility box on the side of the garage. He opened it with a master key. He found the main breaker and the phone line. With a swift, decisive motion, he cut the phone line. Then he threw the main breaker. The microwave clock died. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The house was dead. Inside, the alarm system would be switching to battery backup. It would be beeping a low warning in the hallway, a sound that might wake a light sleeper. We had seconds before Rebecca realized the power was out. We moved to the patio door. The movers positioned themselves on either side of the glass. One of them held a heavy suction cup device, the kind used by glaziers to carry large panes. He attached it to the glass near the handle. The other held a center punch, a small tool designed to shatter safety glass with a single focused impact. I stood behind them, the phlebotomy kit in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. My heart was pounding a rhythm against my ribs that felt dangerous. I wasn't young, I wasn't a soldier, I was a grandfather. But in that moment, staring at the dark glass that separated me from my dying son, I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared my vision and steadied my hands. Clay held up 3 fingers. 3. I took a breath. The smell of rain and wet earth filled my lungs. 2. I thought of Leo, locked in his room upstairs, terrified and alone. I thought of Terrence, the poison coursing through his veins. 1. The mover pressed the center punch against the glass. There was a sharp crack, louder than I expected. The safety glass spiderwebbed, instantly turning into a sheet of 1,000,000 tiny fragments. The man with the suction cup pulled back hard. The entire pane of glass came away with a sound like crushing ice. He set it down on the patio. The way was open. The alarm began to blare, a piercing, high-pitched shriek that tore through the night. "Go!" Clay shouted. We surged forward. I stepped over the threshold, crunching on stray shards of glass. The house smelled of lavender air freshener, covering up the scent of decay. I didn't stop for the alarm. I didn't stop to look for Rebecca. I knew where she would be. She would be coming for the gun. I ran for the stairs. My boots thudded against the hardwood floor. I heard a door slam upstairs. I heard a scream. "Who is there?" Rebecca shrieked. It was a sound of pure terror and rage. I hit the landing and turned toward the master bedroom. I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall, a flash of white silk, a glint of metal. She had the gun. "Get down!" Clay yelled from behind me. I didn't drop. I didn't stop. I ran toward my son's door. I shoulder-checked the wood, bursting into the room. The heart monitor was beeping frantically in the dark, a staccato rhythm of panic. Terrence was thrashing on the bed. I was at his side. But the war had just begun. The sound of the safety glass shattering was louder than a gunshot. It didn't just break. It exploded inward, a waterfall of diamond fragments crashing onto the hardwood floor of the dining room. The noise was absolute, a violent declaration of war that shattered the suburban silence. Immediately, the backup alarm siren began to wail, a piercing, oscillating shriek that vibrated in my teeth. "Go!" Clay roared behind me. I surged forward. My boots crunched over the carpet of broken glass. The air inside the house was stale, heavy with the scent of lavender air freshener masking the underlying rot of sickness. I didn't look left or right. I didn't check the corners. I knew the layout of this house better than my own because I had helped build the extension 5 years ago. I knew exactly how many steps it took to get from the back door to the master bedroom. I hit the hallway running. My breath tore at my throat. I wasn't a young man anymore. My knees protested with every impact, but the adrenaline flooding my system numbed the pain. I was a locomotive. I was unstoppable. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up. There she was. Rebecca stood at the top of the landing. She was wearing a white silk robe that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her blonde hair was loose, wild around her face. She didn't look scared. She looked like a demon who had been interrupted in the middle of a ritual. In her hand, steady as a rock, was a black revolver. I recognized it immediately. It was Terrence's service weapon from his brief time in the reserves. A .38 Special. "You old fool," she screamed. Her voice was distorted, a guttural sound that cut through the alarm. "You should have waited until Friday." She raised the gun. She pointed it directly at my chest. I saw the cylinder turn. I saw her finger tighten on the trigger. "Get down," Clay yelled. I didn't drop. I couldn't. If I stopped now, she would go back into that room. She would pull the plug. She would finish it. I kept running up the stairs, staring down the barrel of the gun. There was a flash of light, a deafening crack. I felt a tug on my tactical vest like someone had punched me in the ribs. The impact staggered me, knocking the wind out of my lungs, but the Kevlar held. I stumbled, my hand gripping the banister splinters digging into my palm. She cocked the hammer again, but she didn't get a second shot. One of the movers, the larger of the two brothers, vaulted over the railing from the hallway below. He didn't use the stairs. He launched himself like a missile. He crashed into Rebecca just as she pulled the trigger a second time. The gun went off, sending a bullet into the ceiling. Plaster rained down on us like snow. Rebecca shrieked, a sound of pure animalistic fury. She fought him, clawing at his face, kicking, biting. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a cornered predator. I pushed past the brawl on the landing. I didn't look back to see if Clay had her secured. That was his job. My job was behind the closed door at the end of the hall. I reached the master bedroom door. It was locked. Of course it was locked. She wanted privacy for her murder. I stepped back and kicked the door right next to the handle. The wood splintered. The door flew open, banging against the wall. The room was dark, illuminated only by the frantic flashing of the heart monitor and the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The smell here was overpowering. Urine, sweat, and that metallic tang of the blue chemical she had injected. I rushed to the bed. Terrence. My son was unrecognizable. He was arching off the mattress, his back bowed in a rigid spasm. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. White foam tinged with pink blood was bubbling from his lips. He was making a terrible gurgling sound like a man drowning in his own fluids. The heart monitor was screaming a high-pitched warning. His heart rate was erratic, spiking and plummeting. He was in cardiac distress. The digoxin overdose was hitting him like a freight train. "Terry," I shouted. I grabbed his shoulders, trying to hold him down, trying to anchor him to the world. He was burning up. His skin felt like it was on fire. Miller, the medic, burst into the room behind me. He took one look at Terrence and dropped his bag. "He is seizing," Miller yelled over the alarm. "Get him on his side. We need to clear the airway." We wrestled Terrence onto his side. He was skeletal, light as a bird, but the seizure gave him a terrifying, rigid strength. Miller forced a bite block into his mouth to keep him from swallowing his tongue. I looked at Miller. "He is dying, isn't he?" Miller checked the pupil response. He checked the pulse. "His heart is fibrillating. We have minutes, Desmond. Maybe less. I need to push epinephrine. I need to get a line in." "No," I said. I grabbed Miller's arm. "Not yet." Miller looked at me like I was insane. "What are you doing?" "He needs meds." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phlebotomy kit. My hands were shaking, slick with sweat. "If we give him meds now, it dilutes the sample." I said, my voice sounding calm and detached, like I was discussing a load-bearing wall. "If he dies, she cremates him. If she cremates him, we have nothing. We need the blood. We need the poison." Desmond Miller set his eyes wide. "He could code while you do this." "Then be ready to bring him back," I snapped. I tied the tourniquet around Terrence's wasted arm. His veins were collapsed, hidden under the bruised, paper-thin skin. I slapped the inside of his elbow, searching for a target. "Please, son," I whispered. "Give me something. Give me a way to save you." A faint blue line appeared. It was weak, but it was there. I uncapped the needle. The room seemed to narrow down to that one point. The alarm faded. Rebecca's screams in the hallway faded. There was just the needle and the vein. I pushed the needle in. Flash! A tiny bloom of dark red blood appeared in the chamber. I pushed the vacutainer tube onto the back of the needle. The blood flowed. It was dark, almost black in the dim light. It filled the vial slowly, agonizingly slowly. "Come on," I urged. "Come on." Terrence jerked. The needle slipped. Steady Miller barked, holding Terrence's arm down with his body weight. I readjusted. The blood kept flowing. One vial full. I popped it off. I pushed the second one on. Desmond Miller warned. "His heart rate is dropping. He is going into arrest." "I need 5 more seconds," I said. The monitor let out a long, continuous tone. Flatline. "Start compressions," Miller shouted. I pulled the needle out. I capped the vial. I threw the kit onto the nightstand. Miller was already on top of Terrence, pumping his chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. I stood back, clutching the warm vials of blood in my hand. I had the evidence. I had the weapon. But I might have just lost the war. I looked at my son's face. He was still. The foam had stopped. He looked like a corpse. "Don't you dare," I whispered. "Don't you dare die on me now." Outside the room, the chaos had reached a fever pitch. I heard heavy boots thudding up the stairs. Police. Real police this time. "Drop the weapon," a voice boomed. "Get on the ground." I walked out of the bedroom. I had to secure the blood. I had to get it to Marcus. In the hallway, the scene was a tableau of violence. Rebecca was pinned to the floor by the mover. Her robe was torn. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. Clay was standing over her, his hands raised as 3 uniformed officers pointed assault rifles at him. "Don't shoot," I yelled, stepping into the hall with my hands up the vials hidden in my palm. "They are with me. We are trying to save him." The police swiveled toward me. "Get on the ground," the lead officer screamed. And then a door opened. It was the door to Leo's room. Leo stepped out into the hallway. He was wearing his dinosaur pajamas. He was holding a cell phone in his hand, the camera light shining like a beacon in the gloom. He didn't look at the guns. He didn't look at the police. He looked at his mother pinned to the floor. Rebecca saw him. Her eyes went wide. "Leo," she screamed. Tell them. Tell them Grandpa went crazy. Tell them he tried to kill us. Tell them, baby." Leo stood there. He was 10 years old, but in that moment he looked like the oldest soul in the world. He raised the phone. He pointed it right at her face. Rebecca's face contorted. "You ungrateful little brat," she shrieked. "After everything I did for you. I did this for us. We were going to be rich, you stupid child. Put that phone down." Leo didn't flinch. He kept the camera steady. The police officers hesitated. They lowered their weapons, slightly confused by the dynamic. A woman screaming about being rich while pinned to the floor. A child recording her. An old man holding blood vials. Leo took a deep breath. His voice was small, but it cut through the noise like a diamond cutter. "Dad isn't dead," Leo said. Rebecca stopped screaming. She stared at him. "He isn't dead, Mom," Leo repeated louder this time. "Grandpa saved him. And I have you on video." He turned the phone screen toward the officers. Even from where I stood, I could see the video playing. It was from earlier. It showed Rebecca outside his window smiling that cold shark smile. It showed her mixing the blue liquid. It recorded her voice through the door, talking to herself about the money. "She tried to kill him," Leo shouted, his voice finally breaking into a sob. "She poisoned him. Check the blue bag." The lead officer looked from the boy to the woman on the floor. He looked at the madness in her eyes. "Check the bedroom," the officer ordered his partner. "Call EMS now." Rebecca began to laugh. It was a high, broken sound. "It doesn't matter," she cackled. "He is dead anyway. I gave him enough to kill a horse. He is gone. And the money is gone. You are all too late." I stepped forward. I held up the vials of blood. "Not too late," I said. Rebecca saw the blood. Her laughter died in her throat. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not the fake fear she used to manipulate, but the cold terror of a predator who realizes the trap has snapped shut on her own leg. The paramedics rushed past me into the bedroom. I heard the defibrillator charge. Clear. Thump. I held my breath. Clear. Thump. And then a sound. Beep. 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 A rhythm. A heartbeat. Weak stumbling, but there. "He is back," Miller shouted from the room. "We have a pulse." I looked at Rebecca. She slumped against the floor, defeated. I looked at Leo. He lowered the phone. He looked at me and nodded. "We did it, Grandpa," he whispered. I walked over to him and pulled him into a hug, burying his face in my chest so he wouldn't have to see them handcuff his mother. I held him tight, feeling his small heart beating against mine. We had broken the house. We had broken the law, but we had saved the foundation, and Friday was canceled. The hallway was a kaleidoscope of red and blue lights spinning against the walls, creating a dizzying strobe effect that made the violence feel surreal. The heavy thud of police boots on the stairs sounded like thunder. More officers were pouring in through the shattered front door, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wall of noise. This was the moment Rebecca had been waiting for. This was her contingency plan. As soon as the first uniformed officer leveled his weapon at the top of the stairs, Rebecca underwent a transformation that was terrifying to witness. The woman who had been screaming obscenities and fighting like a wild animal just seconds ago vanished. In her place was a trembling, traumatized victim. She stopped struggling against the man holding her down and went completely limp. She let out a sob that sounded so genuine, so filled with heartbreak and terror, that for a split second even I questioned what I had seen. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking perfectly. "Please help me!" They broke in. "They have guns. He is trying to kill my husband." She pointed a shaking finger at me. I was standing there in my tactical vest, holding vials of blood surrounded by broken glass and splintered wood. I looked like a maniac. I looked exactly like the violent, senile intruder she had told the police about. She had set the stage perfectly. She had planted the seed of my insanity with the school, with the neighbors, and with the local precinct. Now she was harvesting the fruit of that lie. "My father-in-law has lost his mind," she wailed, burying her face in her hands. "He brought these thugs to rob us. They beat me. They drugged my husband. Please, officer, don't let them hurt my son." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She used every trigger word in the book: drugs, robbery, child endangerment. She turned the narrative on its head so fast that the truth didn't just get buried, it got paved over. The lead officer, a sergeant with a thick neck and eyes that didn't have time for nuance, swung the barrel of his assault rifle toward my chest. His finger was on the trigger. His face was a mask of adrenaline and aggression. "Drop the vials," he roared. "Hands on your head. Get on your knees. Now. Do it now or I will shoot." The air left the room. I stood frozen. If I dropped the vials, they would shatter. The evidence would be gone. If I put my hands on my head, I would lose the only proof that could save my son's life. But if I didn't move, this man was going to kill me. I could see it in his eyes. He saw a threat. He didn't see a grandfather. He saw a man in body armor standing over a crying woman. "I am not armed," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound like the rational engineer I was. "I am his father. She is the one killing him. You have to check the bedroom." "Silence," the sergeant yelled. He took a step forward, closing the distance. "I don't want to hear a word out of your mouth. Get on the ground." Clay was already on his knees, his hands interlocked behind his head. He looked at me, his eyes wide, signaling me to comply. But I couldn't. I couldn't put the blood down. Rebecca saw my hesitation. She saw the standoff. And she pushed. "He has a weapon," she shrieked. "He has a knife in his pocket. He is going to hurt you." It was a lie, a blatant, desperate lie designed to get me killed. The sergeant flinched. He tightened his grip on the rifle. The barrel didn't waver. "Last warning," the officer bellowed. "Down!" I slowly lowered myself to one knee, cradling the vials against my chest with one hand raising the other in the air. I looked at the officer. I looked past the gun. "Please," I said, "just look at the boy. Look at the phone." The officer ignored me. He motioned to his partner. "Cuff him, and check him for weapons." A younger officer rushed forward, grabbing my raised arm and wrenching it behind my back. The pain in my shoulder flared, but I held onto the vials tight against my chest with my other hand. He tried to pull it free. "Open your hand," the officer shouted. "It is evidence," I grunted, resisting him. "It is blood. Do not break it." "Stop resisting," the officer yelled, driving a knee into my back. I was seconds away from being tased or beaten. Rebecca was sobbing louder, a symphony of fake grief covering the sound of her victory. She had won. She had called the cops, she had framed me, and now she was going to walk away while I went to prison and my son went to the morgue. Wait. The voice didn't come from me. It came from Clay. Clay hadn't moved from his position on the floor, but his voice boomed with a command authority that cut through the chaos. "Officer, before you put those cuffs on, you need to look at the boy's phone. And you need to look at the woman standing in your doorway." The sergeant swung his rifle toward Clay. "Shut up. I am a licensed private investigator," Clay said, his voice calm and steady. "My license number is in my back pocket. This is a sanctioned investigation into insurance fraud and attempted murder, and the woman standing behind you is the primary witness." The sergeant blinked. He looked toward the front door where the glass had been shattered. Standing there, framed by the darkness of the night and the flashing lights of the cruisers, was a woman. She was tall, with graying hair and a face that was lined with years of grief. She wore a simple coat, clutching a handbag like a shield. She looked out of place in the violence of the hallway like a ghost who had wandered into a war zone. Rebecca stopped crying. Her head snapped up. She looked at the woman in the doorway. For the first time since I had known her, the color drained completely from Rebecca's face. Her eyes went wide, filled with a recognition that was pure horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The act dropped. The victim vanished. The predator was exposed, staring at the one thing she thought she had buried forever. "Who is that?" the sergeant asked, his gun lowering slightly. "That is Sarah Vance," Clay said. "She is the sister of Michael Vance, the first husband this woman murdered in Arizona 10 years ago." The silence in the hallway was absolute. Even the radio chatter seemed to fade. Sarah Vance stepped over the broken glass. She walked into the hallway, her eyes locked on Rebecca. "Hello, Becky," Sarah said. Her voice was shaking, but it was filled with a decade of rage. "You look just like you did at Michael's funeral. You haven't aged a day. I guess spending his insurance money keeps you young." Rebecca scrambled backward, Crab walking away from Sarah until her back hit the wall. "Get her away from me," Rebecca hissed. "I don't know who she is. She is crazy. This is a setup. Show them the video," Leo Clay commanded. My grandson stepped forward. He held the phone up to the sergeant. The screen was bright in the dim hallway. The officer looked down. He watched the video Leo had recorded minutes ago. He heard Rebecca screaming about the money. He heard her admit she poisoned Terrence. He heard her call her own son ungrateful for ruining her plan. The sergeant watched the video. Then he looked at Rebecca cowering against the wall. Then he looked at Sarah Vance, the living proof of a past crime. Finally, he looked at me holding the vials of blood like they were the crown jewels. He holstered his weapon. He signaled to the officer on my back. "Let him up," the sergeant said. The pressure on my back vanished. I stood up, my knees creaking. I checked the vials. They were intact. The sergeant turned to Rebecca. His face was hard now. The sympathy was gone. "Ma'am," he said. Rebecca tried to stand up. She tried to fix her torn robe. She tried to summon the mask again. "Officer, these people are lying. That video is deepfake. It is AI. They are trying to frame me." "Save it," the sergeant said. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked ominously. "Rebecca Bell, or whatever your name is, turn around and put your hands behind your back. You are being detained." "No," Rebecca screamed. She lunged toward the stairs, trying to run back up to the bedroom, trying to destroy the evidence, trying to finish the job. But Sarah Vance was faster. She stepped in front of her, blocking the path. Rebecca ran right into her. Sarah didn't move. She shoved Rebecca back hard. Rebecca stumbled and fell at the feet of the officer. "It is over," Sarah said. "You are done." The officer grabbed Rebecca's wrists. He snapped the cuffs on. The sound of the ratchet tightening was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I looked at Clay. He gave me a small nod. I looked at Leo. He was crying now, silent tears of relief. I walked over to the sergeant. "My son is in that room," I said. "He has been poisoned with arsenic and digoxin. I have the antidote protocol from the toxicologist. I need these vials to go to the hospital with him." The sergeant looked at me. He saw the engineer. He saw the father. "Go," he said. "The ambulance is outside. Get him out of here." I ran back into the bedroom. Miller was still bagging Terrence. "We got him back," Desmond Miller said. "But he is weak. We have to move now." I helped lift my son onto the stretcher. We carried him out of the house, past his wife, who was screaming curses at us from the floor, past the police, past the shattered glass. We carried him out into the rain. I climbed into the back of the ambulance. As the doors closed, I saw Leo standing in the driveway holding Clay's hand. He waved at me. I held my son's hand as the siren wailed. The nightmare house disappeared in the rearview mirror. We were moving. We were alive. And for the first time in 2 years, the direction we were heading wasn't down. It was forward. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and shouting that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. I sat in the back, clutching the vials of my son's blood like they were holy relics, while the paramedics fought a war against the poison coursing through his veins. Every time the heart monitor dipped or stuttered, my own heart skipped a beat in terrifying unison. We burst through the doors of the emergency room at St. Jude's Hospital, and the chaos of the trauma center swallowed us whole. Doctors and nurses in blue scrubs swarmed the gurney, shouting commands in a language of urgency that I barely understood. I saw Dr. Marcus Evans running toward us, his white coat flying behind him like a cape. I shoved the vials and the printout from his lab into his hands. This is what she gave him. "Marcus," I shouted over the noise of the department. "It is digoxin and arsenic." She hit him with a massive bolus of the heart meds on top of chronic heavy metal poisoning. "You have to chelate him." You have to bind the digoxin. Marcus didn't waste a second asking questions. He looked at the data and then at the gray, lifeless face of my son, and he barked orders that sent the team into a frenzy. Get the digibind now. Start a dimercaprol drip. I want a central line, and I want him on continuous cardiac pacing. They wheeled Terrence into Trauma Bay 1, and the heavy double doors swung shut in my face, leaving me standing alone in the harsh fluorescent glare of the hallway. I was covered in sweat and grime from the break-in, and I was still wearing the tactical vest Clay had given me. People were staring, but I didn't care. I paced the linoleum floor back and forth, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I promised him everything I had left, my house, my pension, my own life. Just let him live. Just let him open his eyes one more time so I can tell him I am sorry I didn't see the monster sleeping next to him sooner. Time lost all meaning in that hallway. It could have been minutes or hours. I watched through the small rectangular window of the trauma bay as they worked on him. It was violent and terrifying. They were shocking his heart. They were pushing fluids. They were forcing tubes down his throat. It looked less like healing and more like combat. I saw Marcus's face tight with concentration as he studied the monitors. The line on the screen was a chaotic, jagged scrawl that looked nothing like the rhythm of life. It looked like a struggle. It looked like a man hanging onto a cliff by his fingernails while someone stomped on his hands. While my son fought for his life down the hall, his executioner was trying to talk her way out of a cage. Rebecca had been brought to the same hospital. She had claimed that the mover who tackled her had broken her wrist, and the police had to clear her medically before they could book her into the county jail. I walked past the treatment rooms and saw a uniformed officer guarding a closed door. I knew she was in there. I could hear her voice shrill and demanding. I stood by the door listening. She wasn't crying anymore. The terrified victim act had evaporated as soon as she realized the police weren't buying it immediately. Now she was pivoting to a new strategy. I heard her talking to Detective Johnson. He begged me to do it, she said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. You don't understand the pain he was in. The autoimmune disease was eating him alive. He couldn't walk. He couldn't eat. He asked me to help him end it. It was mercy. I did it out of love because I couldn't stand to watch him suffer anymore. She was trying to reframe a murder for profit as an assisted suicide. It was a clever move. It might reduce a death penalty case to manslaughter if she could sell it. She was banking on the fact that Terrence wouldn't wake up to contradict her. She was banking on the fact that dead men tell no tales. But she didn't know about the blood. A young doctor came jogging down the hallway, waving a sheaf of papers with the ink still wet. He spotted Detective Johnson and handed him the report. Johnson read it, and his eyes widened. He looked from the paper to the door of Rebecca's room, and his face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. He motioned for me to come over. "Mr. Bell, you need to hear this," he said. He opened the door and walked in. Rebecca was sitting on the edge of the bed holding an ice pack to her wrist. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure hate. "Get him away from me," she hissed. "He is the one who attacked us." Detective Johnson ignored her. He held up the lab report. "Mercy killing," he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is that what we are calling it now?" "It was what he wanted," she insisted, lifting her chin defiantly. "The lab results say otherwise," Johnson said. "We just got the stat toxicology screen back on the blood your father-in-law secured. The levels of arsenic in his system are 100 times the lethal limit. And the hair sample we took shows chronic exposure for 6 months. You weren't helping him die quickly to end his pain. You were torturing him slowly. You were feeding him poison with his breakfast every single day for half a year." Rebecca froze. The color drained from her face. "Arsenic creates a painful, agonizing death." Johnson continued, stepping closer to her. "It causes burning in the extremities, vomiting, and organ failure. It is the opposite of mercy. And the digoxin overdose you gave him tonight wasn't a gentle sleep. It was a chemical heart attack. You wanted him to die in agony so you could cash a check on Friday." Rebecca's face went blank. The sorrow vanished. The indignation vanished. The mask fell away completely, leaving only the cold, dead stare of a reptile who realizes the camouflage has failed. She shrugged. It was a small, casual movement that was more terrifying than any scream. "I didn't think it would take this long," she muttered almost to herself. "He just wouldn't die. He was too strong. It was annoying. He was supposed to be gone months ago, but he kept holding on. I ran out of money waiting for him to quit." The room went silent. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She wasn't sorry she killed him. She was annoyed that he had been hard to kill. She viewed his resilience not as a virtue, but as an inconvenience to her financial planning. Detective Johnson slammed his notebook shut. "You are under arrest for attempted capital murder, insurance fraud, and about a dozen other charges I am going to think of on the ride to the station. Get her out of my sight." 2 officers hauled her up. As they dragged her past me, she didn't look at me. She looked through me. She was already calculating her next move, already trying to find a new angle. But it was over. The math didn't work anymore. A nurse came running up to us. "Mr. Bell," she said, breathless. "He is awake." I turned and ran back to the trauma room. The frantic activity had stopped. The crash cart was pushed to the side. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Terrence was lying there pale and hooked up to a dozen tubes. His chest was rising and falling with a mechanical assist, but his eyes were open. They were foggy and unfocused, swimming with the remnants of the drugs, but they were open. I walked to the side of the bed and took his hand. It was still cold, but it felt different. It felt like there was a hum of life underneath the skin. "Terry," I whispered. "It is Dad. You are safe. She is gone. The police have her. She can't hurt you anymore." He looked at me, and a single tear rolled down his cheek, cutting a track through the grime on his face. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw from the intubation tube they had just removed. He swallowed hard and tried again. Detective Johnson stepped up to the other side of the bed. He had his recorder out. "Mr. Bell, can you hear me?" the detective asked gently. "Do you know who did this to you?" Terrence nodded slowly. He looked at the ceiling as if replaying the last moment of his conscious life. He took a rasping, wet breath and spoke. His voice was like grinding stones, weak and trembling, but the words were clear enough to condemn a soul to hell. She smiled, he wheezed. We leaned in closer. "She came in with the blue needle," he whispered. "She told me it was time to sleep. And she smiled when she pushed the plunger. She watched my eyes roll back. She looked happy. She patted my head and told me to just let go because she needed the money." The detective looked at me. "That is it," he said. "Intent, malice, satisfaction. That is the nail in the coffin. She is never getting out of prison." I squeezed my son's hand. I buried my face in the sheets and let the tears come. "Rest now, son," I said. "The war is over." We won. You just breathe. You just keep breathing." Terrence closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years he slept. It wasn't the sleep of the drugged or the dying. It was the sleep of the saved. I pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down to keep watch. I wasn't going anywhere. I was the guard at the gate, and no one was ever going to hurt him again. The courtroom air was stale and heavy with the scent of floor wax and cheap cologne, but to me it smelled like Judgment Day. 3 months had passed since the night of the raid, and the world outside had moved on, but inside these wood-paneled walls time had stood still waiting for this moment. I pushed Terrence's wheelchair down the center aisle. He was still frail, his skin marked by the scars of the chelation therapy that had scrubbed the heavy metals from his blood, but he was upright. He was alive. And he was ready to watch the woman he married burn for what she did. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. The story of the black widow nurse and the grandfather who broke into her house to save his son had dominated the local news cycle for weeks. Strangers lined the back benches, whispering and pointing as we took our seats behind the prosecution table. Then the side door opened, and the bailiffs brought her in. Rebecca looked like a ghost of the woman who had blocked my path that Tuesday night. Her blonde hair, usually perfectly styled, was dull and limp, hanging in greasy strands around a face that was gaunt and sallow. She had lost weight, maybe 20 pounds, and her orange jumpsuit hung off her frame like a sack. But her eyes hadn't changed. They were still hard. They were still calculating. She scanned the room, not with fear, but with a sneering contempt, as if she couldn't believe she was being inconvenienced by these proceedings. She locked eyes with Terrence for a second and then looked away dismissively. Her lawyer was a man named Sterling, a high-priced defender who specialized in getting monsters off on technicalities. He stood up for his opening statement, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "This is not a case of murder. This is a tragedy of errors. My client is a nurse who was desperate to save her dying husband. She believed he had a rare autoimmune condition. Yes, she administered drugs. Yes, she made mistakes. But she did not do it out of malice. She did it out of love and confusion. This is a case of involuntary manslaughter at worst caused by the immense pressure of caregiving. It was a sickening performance. He was painting her as a martyr, a woman who loved too much and knew too little. I felt Terrence's hand grip the armrest of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Rodriguez, didn't waste time with theatrics. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small black leather notebook. It looked innocent enough, the kind of thing you might use to write down grocery lists or phone numbers. But I knew what was inside. I had found it buried at the bottom of the box of insulin vials in storage unit 385. The DA held the book up for the jury to see. The defense claims this was accidental, she said, her voice ringing with authority. They claim it was misguided care. But accidents do not have a schedule. Accidents do not have a logbook. She opened the notebook and began to read. The courtroom went deathly silent. October 12th, increased digoxin dosage to 0.25 milligrams. Subject complained of yellow vision and nausea. Vomiting induced at 8 p.m. Weight loss is steady. He is becoming compliant. October 24th, switch to arsenic powder in the protein shake. Subject is losing hair and sensation in the extremities. Doctors suspect lupus. Perfect cover. November 1st, he is fighting too hard. Need to increase the sedative load. He needs to be bedridden by Christmas so I can access the accounts. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. This wasn't a medical journal. It was a torture diary. She had documented the destruction of my son with the cold precision of a scientist conducting an experiment on a lab rat. She tracked his pain. She tracked his decline. She celebrated his suffering because it meant she was getting closer to the payout. The DA projected the pages onto the screens for the jury. On the margins of the medical notes were financial calculations. Next to the date of a massive arsenic dose, she had written the balance of the life insurance policy minus the cost of the cremation and the debts she planned to pay off. She had balanced her checkbook with my son's life. I looked at Rebecca. For the first time, her mask cracked. She wasn't looking at the jury. She was staring at the notebook, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She knew. She knew that book was the end of her. There was no spinning this. There was no explaining away a handwritten confession that linked the poison directly to the prophet. The jury looked from the screen to the woman sitting at the defense table, and I saw the change in their eyes. They didn't see a confused nurse anymore. They saw a monster. But the final nail in her coffin wasn't a book. It was a boy. The bailiff called the next witness, Leo Bell. My heart broke as I watched my grandson walk to the stand. He looked so small in the big wooden chair, his feet barely touching the floor. He was wearing a little suit I had bought him for the trial, and he clutched a small toy car in his hand for comfort. He looked terrified, but he also looked determined. He looked like his father. Leo, the DA, said gently, "Can you tell the court what happened in the kitchen on the mornings before school?" Leo took a deep breath. He looked at me, and I gave him a small nod. "You can do this, son. Mom would make Dad smoothies," he said, his voice small and trembling. "She would take the green powder from the jar under the sink, the one she told me never to touch because it was for rats." A gasp went through the gallery. Rat poison. Arsenic. She would put it in the blender, Leo continued, tears starting to well up in his eyes. "She told me it was special medicine. She said Dad was very sick, and if I told anyone about the green powder, he would die faster. She said it was our secret." Rebecca's lawyer stood up to object, but the judge waved him down. And the night before the police came, the DA asked, "What did you see?" Leo wiped his eyes. "I saw her with the blue needle. She was in the hallway. She was talking on the phone to someone. She said she was tired of waiting. She said Friday was too far away. She said she was going to put him to sleep." Leo turned his head and looked directly at his mother. Rebecca was staring at him, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. "Why, Mom?" Leo asked, his voice cracking with a pain that no child should ever feel. "Why did you do it? You told me you loved us, but you loved the money more. You wanted the money more than you wanted Dad. You wanted it more than you wanted me." Rebecca flinched as if he had slapped her. She slumped in her chair, hiding her face behind her hands. That was it. The room felt heavy with the weight of the truth. A 10-year-old boy had dismantled the lie completely. He had exposed the greed that rotted at the core of his mother's heart. The DA simply said, "No further questions." As Leo walked down from the stand, he didn't look at his mother again. He walked straight to me and Terrence. Terrence reached out with his good hand and grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him close. The three of us sat there, 3 generations of Bell men, survivors of a war we never asked for. And as I looked at the jury, I knew it was over. Rebecca wasn't going home. She was going to a cage where the only thing she would ever control again was the time she spent staring at a concrete wall. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like the final bolt being tightened on a bridge meant to last forever. The judge was an older woman with eyes that had seen too much darkness and had no patience for monsters wearing human skin. She looked over her spectacles at Rebecca, who stood at the defense table. Rebecca was trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was rage. It was the vibrating fury of a narcissist who couldn't believe the universe had the audacity to hold her accountable. The jury foreman had read the verdict just moments before. Guilty. Guilty on every single count. Attempted capital murder, insurance fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, forgery. The list of her crimes was longer than the marriage vows she had violated. Rebecca Bell, the judge said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. Your actions display a level of depravity and calculation that is rarely seen in this court. You did not act out of passion. You acted out of greed. You looked at a man who loved you and you saw nothing but a paycheck. You poisoned him slowly day after day, watching him suffer while you planned how to spend his death benefit. You attempted to frame his father and gaslight his son. You are a predator in every sense of the word. I watched Rebecca's hands. They were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at Terrence. She was looking at the man she failed to kill with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. For the crimes of attempted murder and fraud, the judge continued, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will never walk free again. You will never harm another family again. The courtroom erupted. The gallery let out a collective breath of relief, but Rebecca didn't slump. She didn't cry. She lunged. She threw herself toward the railing that separated the defense table from the victims. Her lawyer tried to grab her, but she shook him off with hysterical strength. You ruined everything, she screamed, her face contorted into a mask of ugliness that finally matched her soul. You were supposed to die, Terrence. You were weak. You were pathetic. I gave you everything, and you couldn't even do one thing for me. You couldn't even die right. The bailiffs were on her in a second. They grabbed her arms and hauled her back, but she kept screaming, thrashing against them, her heels scraping against the floor. And you, old man, she shrieked, looking at me, spitting the words. You should have minded your own business. You are going to rot. I hope you all rot. I should have used more arsenic. I should have finished the job. They dragged her toward the side door. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She didn't look like a wife. She looked like a wild animal caught in a trap, biting and snarling until the very end. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off her screams. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence of a storm that had finally passed, leaving the air scrubbed and new. I looked at Terrence. He was crying, but he was smiling. He squeezed my hand. We had survived the hurricane. 12 months later, the landscape of our lives had changed completely. I sold the big colonial house in the suburbs. I couldn't live there anymore, and neither could Terrence. There were too many ghosts in the hallways, too many memories of poison in the kitchen. The bank had tried to foreclose on my own home due to the fraudulent loans Rebecca had taken out, but thanks to Dr. Montgomery and the FBI investigation, the debt was declared null and void as proceeds of a crime. We recovered most of the assets she had stolen, and the rest was covered by insurance fraud protection. We took the money and we bought a small farm 20 miles outside the city. It was a fixer-upper, a rambling farmhouse with a wraparound porch and 10 acres of land that needed work. It was exactly what we needed. We needed to build something new. We needed to use our hands for something other than fighting. I stood by the fence of the new corral, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The air here smelled of hay and earth, not bleach and sickness. I looked across the yard to the driveway. Terrence was there. He wasn't the mountain of muscle he used to be. The arsenic had done permanent damage to his kidneys and his nerves. He still had days where his hands shook and his legs wouldn't hold his weight. He would likely use a wheelchair for long distances for the rest of his life. But today, he was standing. He was gripping a walker, his knuckles tight, sweat beading on his forehead. His physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who reminded me a bit of my late wife, was encouraging him. One more step, Terrence, she said. You got this. He took a step. His leg dragged a bit, but he planted his foot firmly. He took another. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. He was rebuilding his body the same way we were rebuilding the barn, one beam at a time. He looked up and saw me watching. He didn't look away in shame like he used to when he was sick. He grinned. It was the old grin, the one that reached his eyes. "Look at me, Dad," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "I am walking to the porch today." I gave him a thumbs up. I knew he would make it. He was a bell. We didn't break easy. Out in the field near the barn, the sound of a basketball bouncing echoed against the wood. Leo was there shooting hoops on the new goal we had installed. He had grown 3 inches in the last year. The shadows under his eyes were gone. The fear that used to make him flinch at loud noises had faded. He was just a boy again. He dribbled the ball, faked left, and took a shot. It swished through the net. "Yes," he shouted, throwing his arms up. He saw me and ran over the ball tucked under his arm. "Grandpa, did you see that?" "Nothing but net." "I saw it," I said, ruffling his hair. "You are getting good, kid. Maybe better than your dad." Don't tell him that. Leo laughed. "He still thinks he can beat me in horse from the chair." Leo looked toward his father, who was slowly making his way up the ramp to the porch. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of fierce protectiveness. "He is doing good today, right, Grandpa?" Leo asked. "He is doing great," I said. "He is getting stronger every day, just like you." Leo nodded. "We are all getting stronger." That evening, after the sun had gone down and the crickets had started their nightly chorus, we sat on the porch, the 3 of us. 3 generations of Bell men. I sat in my old rocking chair. Leo sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood with a pocket knife I had given him for his birthday. Terrence sat in his wheelchair, a blanket over his legs to ward off the evening chill, a mug of hot tea in his hands. It was peaceful. It was the kind of peace you only appreciate when you have walked through fire to get to it. We watched the fireflies dancing over the grass. We didn't need to talk. The silence was comfortable. It was the silence of understanding. But Terrence cleared his throat. He put his mug down on the railing. He looked at me and then at Leo. "You know," he said softly, "for a long time I thought I was going crazy. When I started getting sick, I thought it was just bad luck. But then, when it got worse, when the confusion started setting in, I started having these thoughts, dark thoughts. I thought maybe she didn't love me. I thought maybe she was hurting me. But I pushed them away. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself she was my wife and she was taking care of me." He looked down at his hands, the hands that were scarred from the IVs and the poison. "I was weak, Dad," he said. "I let her in. I let her take over. I almost left you guys. I almost died believing that I was a burden to you. I leaned forward. You were never a burden, son. You were a victim. She was a professional. She fooled everyone." "Not everyone," Terrence said, looking at Leo. "She didn't fool him, and she didn't fool you." He reached out and took my hand. His grip was still not what it used to be, but it was warm. It was alive. "You didn't just save my life that night, Dad," Terrence said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just kick down the door and stop the poison. You saved my soul. You showed me that I was worth fighting for. You showed me that even when I couldn't stand up for myself, I had a father who would stand up for me. You gave me back my son. You gave me back my name." I felt a lump in my throat the size of a golf ball. I squeezed his hand back. "I am a structural engineer," I said, my voice rough. "I keep things from falling down. That is the job." Terrence smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. "You are a hell of a lot more than an engineer, Dad. You are the foundation." Leo stood up from the steps. He walked over and wrapped his arms around Terrence's neck, burying his face in his father's shoulder. Terrence hugged him back, closing his eyes, breathing in the scent of his son. I got up and wrapped my arms around both of them. We stood there on the porch in the cool night air, 3 men holding each other up. We were scarred. We were battered. We had lost time and money and innocence. But we were together. The poison was gone. The monster was in a cage, and we were free. I looked out at the dark fields, at the future stretching out before us. It wasn't the future we had planned, but it was ours. We had survived the winter of our lives. We had endured the cold and the darkness, and now finally we were ready for the spring. I looked at my son and my grandson, and I knew that no matter what came next, the structure would hold. The bridge was solid. We were home. Looking back at the wreckage of those years, I learned that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to keep the peace. I thought love meant politeness, but I learned that true love is a shield and a sword. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a smile and makes you breakfast. But no matter how deep the darkness gets, the truth is a structural beam that cannot be broken. We rebuilt our lives not by forgetting the past, but by securing our foundation with absolute honesty and unshakable loyalty. If you have ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong when everyone else said it was fine, let me know your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and survival. Stay safe out there.